Fabulous with Vips and Vicky. The ThinqShift podcast for professionals who aspire to be fabulous leaders. Those who not only succeed, but also purposefully seek to reinvent the world.
Welcome to another episode of Be Fabulous. Today, Vips and I are discussing a topic around compassion clash, kindness versus a high-performance culture. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, we know that some people want to work in organizations that prioritize well-being. Leaders often want to prioritize business results. And the question is, are these two things at odds with each other, or is there a way to combine them in some way? And if you combine them, what does that mean? How do you not go too far? And what are the different levers that we have to be thinking about? We know that there are many organizations out there that seem to do this well. Patagonia is a good one, where it's renowned for its commitment to what it does for the environment and the employees, but it also maintains a high standard of performance and profitability. There are many, many complex factors in here, and Vips and I have both worked in organizations where we've seen leaders change up the organization and get it to be high performance, but it loses the supportive nature, which means people no longer want to work there. On the other hand, we've also seen many environments that are highly supportive and they don't drive the business results. So Vips, this is a good conversation filled with complexity as per the theme of this series. What are your thoughts here?
It's interesting, isn't it? This one's super interesting to me because I think most of us, if I put myself in the sort of shoes of a person looking for a job or an employee, if you will, then I'd be like, yeah, I want a culture that's kind and supportive and facilitates growth and blah, 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 right? Which is great. And that's great. So then your recruiters are going to figure out that that's what people want to hear. So then they're going to market those features of their environment and their culture. And then those people are going to end up believing it and join, okay? And then a company is really going to try to do its best, maybe try and do its best in that space. But then the expectations will be so high, and then reality kicks in that, oh my God, we're actually a business and we do actually have to make money. And that does mean we have to do a whole bunch of stuff that maybe we don't want to do, right? And how does that work? And then the first time you get the sort of the twinge of accountability, or someone suggesting that your performance needs to be better, or more realistically, a goal or an objective that gets set in your goals or OKRs or whatever your system is, and you're petrified because you know you're out of your depth, or you don't like the fact that you're going to be held accountable to a result, and suddenly it's not a kind and supportive culture no more. It's like, this is now hard. And it just blows up. And I say that in jest, but we see that all the time, you know?
And Vips, as you're sharing that, it takes me back to when we were in the UK building that amazing little place we built together with a bunch of others. And we wanted to do it all. And I remember the first time we had someone who was going to be a young mother, and we wanted to figure out the maternity policy, and we were like, let's give them a year. Wouldn't that be amazing? Trying to create everything that was good for the individual. And then we did the economics of it, of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people going out at the same time. It just didn't make business sense. We couldn't stay alive. There was no financial backbone to all of that. And so reality kicked in and became more measured based on a number of factors.
Yeah, it's complex stuff. I mean, it's complex stuff because ultimately you hit up against structural or systemic constraints that you may want to do all those things to, and more, but most of us want nice big houses by the beach and our own private islands and so forth, and that's just, if everyone had those things, then there need to be more islands, right? I mean, it wouldn't work. So, I think this is where, I think it's actually it's an interesting topic, and I know I'm kind of joking about it. You're right. I see loads of those. So even your example, I think you use the Patagonia, who, by the way, I'm a Patagonia customer. I love their stuff, right? But they are really, really expensive for the stuff you get, right? And so if if they weren't able to get away with their product being that expensive, okay, then all of those things that you're talking about wouldn't exist, right? Yeah. And so it is affected in economic terms. It's a luxury brand, And as a luxury brand, you tend to have higher levels of profitability, which then means you can do more of those sorts of things. But those things, you don't stay highly profitable forever, especially in the kind of the branded world of things like that, whether it be clothing, whether it be fitness brands, whether it be those things. I promise you, 20 years from now, Patagonia will not be the sexy thing that it is right now. I mean, Peloton's seen that the hard way over the last year, where they went, I think it's 97% down in overall valuation in 1 year. These things can be, the best thing since sliced bread, and then someone realizes that, it's just too expensive for what it is, and quite frankly, people move on to something else. Especially in a consumer-driven society like the States, it's a fickle place to be, and I think but I think that also plays into how people and employees will also look at this topic of where I want to work, where, what I expect my working environment to be like, and so forth. And I think you've even seen it. I know we're seeing this. If you think about the kind of working environments that even, let's take the big tech companies were creating 5, 6, 7, 10, 15 years ago, because the talent was so scarce. Yeah. I mean, the volume, the best talent is always scarce, but the sort of the mid-range of the talent, if you like, was still scarce. They had to do a tremendous number of things, free food, gourmet chefs, fantastic venues, fantastic locations, all of these things, right? As a way to be kind, if you will. And then those create economic differentiators, people join, and so forth. COVID hits, no one even wants to go to the offices. That's a whole different topic. But the point I'm trying to get across is, when suddenly those organizations just don't need those people in that volume as much. And suddenly it's what's Wall Street want to hear with our stock price, and what's the performance that's required, and are we beating our expectations, and I want to make sure my share options or my shares are worth whatever 400% more than they are right now, because I do want the private island in off Hawaii or whatever, right? So I think, to me, this idea of kindness and high performance is almost like a relative thing based on the company, the industry, the market, and the economic cycle. But I don't think most people think of it that way, right? They think of it as a static, stable thing. And I just think, you can just afford to be kinder when you're making loads of money. You can't afford to be kinder. I'm talking about as an organizational level. Yeah. And organizational, if you're not making a tremendous amount of money, it's a lot harder to be perceived to be that kind. So then you start talking about, well, are we talking about organizational behaviors, or are we talking about I can be very kind, but I might be constrained by what I can do at a business level that someone might think is unkind. Your maternity example is a great example of that. Well,
let's look at it through 3 lenses then, Vips. Let's start with the employee, and then let's do the manager, and then let's do the leader.
Okay.
So as an employee, I'm going to have different identity beliefs. I might think I want a culture that's kind and supportive, or I might just want to come to work and do my job and leave me alone, and I want nothing to do with any of that. So let's think about from an employee perspective, how can employees think about this dynamic of a supportive, compassionate, kind environment versus business results? And I'm putting them on either end of the spectrum where they're not really, just for the purpose of this conversation. But what's a good way for employees to be thinking about, you've touched briefly on the organization, the economic cycles, but let's talk through that in a bit more detail. How do employees wrap their heads around these dimensions as they're thinking about who to work for, who do they work for, and what can they actually expect? It's a little bit like when you and I came to the US from the UK. You went to Atlanta, I went to LA. If I came to LA expecting the 405 to be a dream and not have high state taxes, well, that's ridiculous. I came to the UK, came to California, and that is the price of being here. It's the same thing as we go into organizations. You go into organizations and there's inherent tension between all these things. That you can't have your cake and eat it. And you can certainly do certain things, but how do employees get their heads wrapped around how to think about this in the best way? So as they're looking at new organizations, as they're looking at their organization, they're looking at it through the right lens.
Yeah. So my view is, I think, it's helpful to look at the extremes, but know that ultimately the game is to try to fuse both, in a way that suits what is appropriate for you. So the way I would maybe think about it, if I was an employee, right, and this is very simplistic, right, because you can fuse the two together. But the more I want a kind, supportive environment, what I'm really looking for is more stability, a very clearly defined job, if you like, in terms of what's expected of me and so forth. And that's likely to be an environment where there's just not a lot of change. Okay, so think, I don't know, at an extreme, think the DMV, right? Think a government department, okay? Think the post office.
Higher ed.
Okay, higher ed, okay?
Yeah.
These are like, think of them as institutions, or even the kind of companies that are just institutions. Like, actually, I don't want to name them because I'll upset someone. Yeah. But you get my point, right? These are, they're going to always be around. Your AT&Ts are always going to be around. Your EHIs are always going to be around. Your Walmarts are always going to be around. I mean, that kind of thing, okay? And so the idea behind that is they've reached a level of scale and mass where it's so, where your particular job is a small cog in this machine, and therefore it means that there's lots of people that can do that. It's easier to spread around workload. It's easier to know what's expected of you. And as a result of that, it works. The system works, and it can feel kind. Okay? Now, so that would be kind of the one way. So to me, that kind of environment, you want to optimize it if you don't like feedback or anything that you might perceive as criticism. If you've got very thin skin, okay, if you just want a job, like, I just want a job. I don't define myself from my work. I don't define myself from, just purely from the perspective of my career, or maybe I'm at a stage in my career where I just need things to be simple.
Yeah,
okay,
and relatively stable.
Relatively, and it's all relative. Right? I mean, it's all relative to whatever it was you were doing before.
But then the cost of that, Vips, the cost of that means...
Yeah, so then you go to the cost of that, if I stay on that side, will be, you're going to have probably a reasonably stable job. You're probably going to have limited promotion prospects, or if you do, it'll be over long periods of time. If you were in an environment that was, quote unquote, more high performance before, you probably find you're earning less, maybe, but the benefits are probably better. Okay.
Yeah. And also from a teaming perspective, there's probably less real and honest conversations. So
because you don't need them.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's more transactional. Actually, it works really well if you're remote. A topic that we covered in another one. Like if you're an information worker, office worker, if you like, that works if you're remote, and your organization will tolerate it. Okay. Yeah. Because your interface between you and your employer is clean. It's very, very clean. It's very transactional. It doesn't require too much fluidity. You're not chasing huge promotions. You're very much in a work to live kind of model where you need a job and you want to do a good job, and that's great. And you want to be in an environment that's supportive and caring and so forth. Okay. And so that side of thing at the extreme is probably the consequence. Yeah. Yeah.
And it can feel a little bit for those that are really high performant as sort of mediocre performance, but that's in the context of the environment.
Right. So correct. So I would say that's going to, you're right. And I think that's true for all of these. Like, high performance in media might still be low performance in the context of investment banking.
For sure.
Yeah. So you're right. I think you have to, it's always relative to whatever you're comparing it against, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go the other way then as an employee and you decide, I'm not at that stage in my life, because there's also the life stages we have to think about. Where are you in terms of your family? Yeah. What level of risk are you prepared to assume? What kind of lifestyle do you want? But if you're in the, I want a high performant environment. It's who I am. I like the buzz. I like the hard conversations, the real conversations, the pushing the goals. Lots of things change all the time. There's lots of instability as we keep changing. What is the cost of that environment? Yeah,
so, well, firstly, let's start with the good stuff. Yeah. There's a lot of stretch. It's continually changing. The upside opportunity is enormous. Yeah. You're likely to earn more. You're likely to be in an urban environment, like an economic center in New York. LA, San Francisco, Bay Area, even the Chicagos, even the Atlantas, even like, you're likely to be urban. I think is probably the way I would describe it. And by the way, and you're likely to feel that you're around people who are also top of their game, or more people that are top of their game. So that's something, right? You will tend to, if you want to be challenged and you want to be great at something, you want to be around people that are also great at whatever it is you are. It's like athletes. An athlete's never going to get better unless they're surrounded by really good athletes. And so I think there's that side that's the good side of it, if you like. A bad side of it.
Yeah, I was just on that one. I was watching the Federer documentary, his last 12 days, and he was talking about, his friendship with Nadal and how on the court there was this intense rivalry because each of them were pushed to be even better as they played with each other, but then this deep friendship and love for each other as well. And it was just, both of them recognized it as a little unusual to be able to have both and hold both.
And I think in the history of sports, you don't see that very often. I don't know, man. I can't think of any other example. There's probably 2 or 3 examples like that in our long and illustrious histories. So yeah, you're right. It's very rare. And I think that's what happens when you do it, when you are able to fuse. And we'll get to that a little bit later when we talk about orgs. But you asked the question, which was, all right, so what's the downside of it? Well, okay, burnout, work stress, anxiety, keeping up with the Joneses. I've got myself into debt.
Imposter
syndrome. Numbing. You call them numbing behaviors. Where you're living someone else's success criteria. I think it's very hard. I think it's very hard to feel worthy in those environments because you are disproportionately anchoring yourself to normative beliefs of that environment, which is just going to be work, win, work, win, work, win, work, win, work, win, play, work, win, right? And that's grueling.
And the definition of winning is
changing, and
changing.
It's always going to be more than whatever it is you have.
Yeah.
I was talking to someone just, as an aside, who's a guy who's he's an entrepreneur. He's built his business. He's looking to sell the business, and he's gonna sell the business for about $35-40 million, something like that. Okay, it's not a huge business. It's that kind of, and he was getting bent around the axle around, I'm not, what can I do to make the 35 million, 40 million? And he was like stressing himself out for months and months and months and months. I'm like, it's not going to make any difference to your, if it's 35 or 350, okay, that's a different conversation. 35 to 40, it's honestly not going to make any difference. Like, he goes, you're right. I don't know why I'm doing this so much. He called his, the bankers that were helping him merchandise his company and said, look, the reality is, I'm fine with anything north of 25. I just want to be done in the next 8 months, right? And that's a very different way of looking at it. But you won't look at it that way if you're in that high performance grind.
Win.
Yeah. Because then because that 35 to 40 becomes an ego thing rather than the reality of anything that's going to make any difference. It's just not going to make any difference, And I think that happens. It propagates, and then people's identities get tied into their professional identities and what they, and then what happens normally? There's people are miserable in their 50s. Yeah, if they make it that far, if they make it that far without breaking down,
really hard to retire because your identity is your work.
Yeah.
And it attaches back to our podcast last time of the simplicity perspective that I found on my long trip, because when you realize there's actually very little you do need and how wrapped up we are in this consumerism and what are we chasing, it's just really nice to go back to that. Okay.
I think also from an individual point of view, just to square it back up, if what you want, you have to have a thick skin to be in a high performance environment, because you have to and not just say you like feedback in a kind of a, if you will, an HRE way, right? But I mean like, no. I absolutely need to know where I'm going wrong because I want to improve it next time, right? And you don't mind it being direct, yeah? And so I think this is where Netflix profess this. I don't know how much they actually live it on a day-to-day basis, but I think this is kind of where the idea for where things like radical candor and so forth come from. You can have radical candor if everyone's got a thick enough skin to take it, but that only works if the people are tuned to high performance and you're making enough money to be able to justify high enough salaries so that people don't get offended enough that they walk away. right?
Yeah.
And that that's it's a different. The equation's a little bit different, but then you're going to get more and more high performance and more athletes, but you're also going to have more and more people you're going to create more human wreckage as well. So then you have to have processes to deal with, how are people exited when they hit their ceiling or when they burn out. You have to look at ways of either not caring that they're burning out or caring for them in a way that recognizes that this environment is no longer going to be appropriate for them, and how do we support them in terms of outplacement and stuff like that, or just even their emotional well-being. So I think that kind of, on the other hand, you're way more likely to make more money. There's that too. And so if you want your house in the Hamptons or, in the Palisades or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You're going to probably have to be that person. And I think sometimes we turn that into the proxy of senior people and junior people. And I think it's more to do with the mentality of the aspiration.
Yeah, you're right, Vips. You're right. So let's look at it from the perspective of managers and leaders then. You've been a superstar performer, you've been promoted, this manager, perhaps you've done that for a period of time, and now you're promoted to being a top-notch exec. You've got a different set of responsibilities, but you may not have wrapped your head around all of this, and you may lean more towards, I want to create a kind and supportive environment, or you may lean more towards, I want results at all costs, or you might be somewhere in the middle. Like how do managers and leaders wrap their heads around this whole thing?
So I think this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Because statistically speaking, more of those high performance culture type of superstar performers will be the ones that get asked to be managers. So
for sure,
very few people are going to get promoted to managers because they're kind, right? Or they're nice to be around. Yes, that's a nice to have, but it's only a nice to have if the performance results were good enough. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
So that means that a disproportionate proportion of your awesome managers are likely to be shit managers.
Or business focused.
I mean, in terms of kindness, in terms of supportive behaviors, in terms of because they've got to where they've got to by being high performance in their craft.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not bad. Okay, so I think this is where, when you look at this, is to me where ultimately every, let's call it manager, every, whatever we want to call that thing, the people that are responsible, whether it's managers, directors, whatever the title happens to be. This is where I think, now you have to really start thinking like, we win as a team. We don't, it's not just me. I can be a good player, but if we don't win as a team, we're not likely to win ultimately, and that I think is a shift, because now what you're saying is we kind of have to have enough of those high performance behaviors, but we have to create the culture of, let's call it support, kindness, whatever you want to call it, such that people stick with you to take the edge off, if you like, the high performance bit, to allow more people to grow together. So it has to be more forgiving, but it has to still be a stretch, but it has to be fun, and it has to be forgiving, but it also has to be accountable. And now you're into art. Yeah. And this is why, we have so few good people managers, because it's an art. It's not just go and follow this 6-step process and away you go. So the way I like to break it down, Vicky, is, I read an article once. I can't remember where it was. I apologize to whoever I'm stealing this idea from. But it's kind of idea that, when you look at teamwork overall, two things are going to kind of pull you towards high performance. And those are going to be fundamentally, or going to impact that most. One's going to be kind of your leadership style and how you role model yourself, and how you set goals, and how openly and non-hedged feedback flows. Okay, so those two things will generally create higher levels of short-term performance. Okay, but they're also likely to create lots of positional power-based behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
feels authoritative.
It's going to feel authoritative. It's going to feel
hierarchical.
It's going to feel hierarchical. It's going to feel like I don't get to collaborate in anything. It gets imposed on me. You might get negative feedback that the environment's not particularly supportive. This kind of stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
On the other hand, so that's kind of on the performance side, if you like. But on the other side, you've got two real things, which is your being, your manner of how you spend your hours, how you spend your meetings, how you make time for other people, how you keep your pulse on what's going on. I call that supportive behavior. But supportive behavior, so on that side, you've got supportive behavior and this kind of team adaptability and orientation. And that supportive behavior for me ultimately only works if there's some kind of common identity. We all believe in something. Like we all believe at ThinqShift, we all believe that leaders do matter. And if you can't shift the mindsets and behaviors of key leaders, then pretty much everything else you do is going to be a waste of time, right? If we didn't truly believe that, then it would be hard to deal with the crap along the way and the disagreements that would occur in terms of what we do and what we don't do and so forth. Okay.
Yeah. And that's also relative to the economic environment and the business backdrop. Yeah. So we're always looking at that.
Yeah, but even look at sports teams. The soccer's on right now, right? I should say football for the Europeans out there. Most of the audience is American. But we got the Euros and we got the Coppers, right? I mean, they're going to win all of these teams, whether it's Argentina or Brazil, or in Europe, it's heaven. I pray England, can't see it, hope so. Whoever wins, they're going to win as a team. But you can have the best player in the world and still lose, and so here now that works because ultimately they all want to win for their countries or their clubs, yeah. And so without that really, really strong sense of shared goal, if you like, shared values, shared need, like the thing that we can all agree on, you won't tolerate tough decisions, tough feedback, tough behaviors, high stretch goals, and so you won't put yourself through the torment that they put themselves through in training every day. Our athletes are good examples of this. Okay, and you won't tolerate the relationship conflict that will inevitably arise because ultimately these top players are competing with each other because they all want to be in the starting 11, and that's what happens in work in the work environment as well. At some level, you want people. Every fabulous manager, awesome manager, top-notch exec should be developing 2 or 3 people that could replace them. But that means you are setting up the conditions for a competition at some level, Yeah. So on the one hand, you want to support these people because they're your most fabulous ones. On the other hand, they're competing with each other because your job's unlikely to get split into 3. There's that.
Plus it requires a huge degree of self-security in having people that could replace you.
Yeah. And those sorts, and this is kind of why I think it's becoming so much more important also that, not important, more of a factor in terms of how you think about recruiting the people that you have high aspirations for growth for inside your organization, because they got to have a lot of emotional fortitude. You just have to be able to have people angry with you most of the time. That's the world we live in. And people go and post on Glassdoor, or they, if you're an athlete, you get all sorts of crap over X or Instagram or whatever, right? I mean, you just have to learn to numb all that out, and still be optimistic and positive and do what you need to do and find the strength to get up out of bed and still make it happen. And, most people, they don't want that. Most people don't want to feel like they did something wrong, or things that attack their ego or their sense of personal worth, or something that feels unkind or unpleasant. And who can blame them? I don't blame them. But it's a price, And so then when you look at that, the way I think about it is, that's just kind of why if I want a high performance team, I have to now find a way to fuse high performance culture with a supportive team orientated structure, because that then gives you a common reason to shoot for the goals, but you always know you've got your back covered. But you also know that you can't keep getting forgiven over and over again in the same areas, because otherwise someone else is going to overtake you. Yeah. And so you have to be willing to be open. I'm not using the word transparent. I'm using the word open with people as to the velocity of growth that's expected and why that's ultimately good, not just for the person, but for all the individuals. And if that's not what those people want, then those cultures and those environments tend to reject or eject those folks if you want the high performance. And again, the high performance only matters if you need high performance relative to your industry or your market or so forth. And that to me is the challenge. And when people figure that out, they realize they can actually work less, okay? And they can achieve better results. But it normally takes years for people to figure that out.
All right, so Vips, you're a CEO, you're part of the C-suite, and you're trying to create a plan for the next 6 months, the next year, and where the organization's going.
Yeah.
What kind of things do you have to think about as you're thinking about performance versus supportive environment, given, you navigating these really tricky waters that are very unclear.
Yeah, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? And that's the reality. But the way I think here, the way I would look at it at that level, or the way I guide people to look at it, is don't look at it as making a choice around the culture or the attributes of kindness and high performance. Look at it more through the lens of, okay, how are we doing? What's our market looking like? How are we performing relative to our competitors? Are we growing? Are we shrinking? Do we have cost pressures? Is capital moving away from our growth areas? Are our core customer bases doing well or suffering? It's always going to be uncertain in election year. So you're going to have this kind of wobbly period. So I think the way I would look at it is I would look at those external factors, what we call systemic factors. Okay. And then based on those systemic factors, I then look at my non-negotiables from a values or philosophical layer perspective. What am I prepared to do? What am I not prepared to do in terms of ultimately how I want to treat people? Okay. Or what is the right decision? And I would combine those two and say, okay, on that basis, then I think this period, it's almost like looking at a curve and saying, okay, this period requires this period requires more of a high performance behavior tinge, if you like. I need 20% more, if you like, in that direction. And that's going to mean that we're going to hold people more accountable. We're going to set tougher goals. We're going to, but we're going to communicate why. Yeah. And I think
is the key.
And that's the key.
That is the key.
That is the key.
Yeah.
And I think what we normally do is right. Because I think normally what we do is either at very senior levels, we either assume that people can see that for themselves and therefore don't tell them, or we think they're too stupid to understand it or care about it, therefore we don't bother. Or three, because you know it's going to create a shitstorm and you don't want a shitstorm. So it's like, screw it. I just make the decision and go anyway. That one tends not to work anymore because everyone has a megaphone. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think, what I'll describe as old school leaders are very frustrated, because it feels like they can't action things fast or change in directions fast, particularly in larger companies, because just the inertia and friction required to gain any kind of common understanding down an organization is extremely time consuming and expensive, and ultimately in most organizations a lot more vindictive and aggressive than it was maybe 15, 20 years ago, just because of the way things have changed and evolved. And so I think that's on the one hand, we get more engagement from people who care. On the other hand, we get more engagement from people who care, right? And I think that causes a different type of leadership challenge at the top. And so I think what you ultimately end up with is the most fabulous, the kind of leaders that are most adaptable. They are able to balance those supportive and team orientation behaviors at the same time as forcing more accountability, and yet somehow feeling honest, trustworthy. They don't appear disingenuous. And quite frankly, I think the biggest thing is making the tough decisions with regards to their senior leadership teams. I think what often happens at the very top is you develop a lot of loyalty to certain people who are just not cutting it for a change in where the market is, or maybe the stage of the organization evolution means that
they might have been good.
They might have been good for a different. Yeah, they might have been good for a different journey, but they're kind of loyal and they're indebted, so they kind of protect them. And the consequence of that is it's kind to that person, but it's unkind to everybody else under them. So I think that would be my key takeaway on that, which is I think often at the very core C-suite, it's very easy to feel you're being kind to your circle, your direct reports, your inner circle, whatever, when in fact you're causing untold misery to people, a couple of skip levels below. And that's a hard thing to square. But ultimately, that's why I think the periodic stock check, if you like, of your executive talent is really, really important. But at the same time, particularly in large companies, organizations are discouraged from making those changes too quickly because it can suggest that you're incompetent and you've got an unstable team, and why can't you build a cohesive team that's more stable than so it's a balancing act. And I think ultimately the really good executives this is kind of why they have to be very good at what we would call stakeholder management, political discourse, knowing how to tap dance the difficult conversations, not answering totally, knowing how to get themselves out of tricky questions. I mean, all of those competencies become important because sometimes you don't know, and there is no right answer, and you don't want to inadvertently send a message you don't want to send.
And that's why CEOs get paid so much, even though nobody knows what they do. It's all those things that are really hard to understand and quantify, but that's what they're doing continually as they look outward and inward, and it's not easy.
And people don't realize how hard it is. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
It's very, very. I mean, it takes a certain type of beast to want. It's no different to actually professional athletes. It takes a certain type of beast to want to put themselves through that kind of. I mean, just think about what a professional athlete has to do from a health perspective, from a nutrition perspective, from a food perspective, from a sacrifice perspective. Just constant pain, right? Working through it. Cryo chambers, ice baths. I mean, just all sorts. I mean, and that's before they even do their work. And I mean, and most of them become a brand if they're any good, and then they have to manage endorsements, and it's
very little time for their families.
And or they're traveling constantly. People don't realize how much you give up an awful lot. But I think it's also, but it's totally understandable, right? They get paid very well as well. So you get paid very well. So, you're kind of there to absorb the crap. You're there to absorb you're there to absorb the negative Glassdoor responses. You're there to, you're there to be ridiculed, and you're there to be attacked. And that's why I think you could have so much emotional stability and fortitude to be able to do those things and still make the right decisions. And that's also why I think we always say, what is the data telling you? Not, go back to the data, go back to the facts, go back to the data. Now the problem is now we got data to support anything we want to support, right? So now, now going back to the data doesn't actually help because, well, then which data? I'll find whichever data I want to support whatever it is that I care about. So, now I think we're in a place now where those executives have to be a lot more quote unquote fabulous leaders, because they have to really be willing to operate from a place of, this is what I believe is right, and what constitutes having integrity and operating within the legal framework that I'm allowed to operate in, and those sorts of things become a lot more necessary. And I think but I think those are hard because we live in a society now and in an environment, both in the working environment but outside the working environment as well. Whereas, we tend not to want to get into complex problems. We tend to want someone to blame. And blaming someone seems a lot easier. And because if you can blame someone, then you can replace someone. And if you can replace someone, you can say you're doing something, but you have the same problem 6 months later with someone else. I think that's the. And by the way, someone who's doing terrible, next quarter, suddenly they're the best thing since sliced bread. And then the next quarter, they're terrible again. And, so that kind of, you have to have so much internal core strength, psychological core strength. And I think that's what's breaking so many C-suite executives over the last 5 years. Just don't have the core strength to deal with that kind of volatility. But what I will say is, you never create a fabulous organization or genuinely consistent and sustainable performance if you can't combine your definition of kindness with an appropriate level of high performance relative to your industry. And I think that is something that everyone should be thinking about. Whether you're the head of a private school, or whether you're in higher ed, or whether you're in a corporate environment, whether you're a tech company, whether you're a Fortune 500 company, that's something that I think is recognized. And it's also why so much emphasis is placed on leadership. Do we have the right leaders? Do we have the right managers? How do we fix that problem? but it's also hyper difficult to tightly correlate to any specific outcome, because it's like light, you know, everything gets brighter when you have good leadership, but everything gets darker if you have terrible leadership. But you can't really say that because of this, these 7 things happened.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Wow. That was deep.
That was deep. Let's bring it up a level and talk about what we talked about. So, for employees, the key perspective here is to think about a supportive environment. We'll reuse that word rather than a kind environment, and a high-performing environment. And what is the market requiring in your sector, in your industry, in terms of economics, and what is your organization doing, and how does that fit for who you are and what you want for your stage of life? If that fits, great, and you know the costs, you know the benefits, and that's okay. And if it doesn't, then you know what to do about that.
I think what you just said there, that's like the anchoring constraints. Like an environment can't be quote unquote more supportive or kinder beyond that constraint.
Yeah.
You know?
But it's worth knowing, and I don't think a lot of people
we didn't even think about it.
Yeah. And then for managers and leaders, looking at it through the lens of, well, now I've got to create the environment that has enough of the teaming supportive behaviors in order to drive the goals. And that's a whole nother competency set that needs to be developed, and reason why we exist, to help them do that. And then for CEOs and those orchestrating organizations, they've got to be constantly looking at the external factors and what's best required for that particular 6 months or a year. And how do you communicate, choreograph, take the organization through that so it doesn't feel like whiplash, but also be prepared for, a backlash of comments when things change, because nobody likes change.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Vicky. I think on that sort of CEO, senior exec, I think the ones that do well are able to stick to a 4, 5, 6, 7 year vision of the future. We call it North Star in our world, because I think you need something to anchor you. If you only have like 6 month or 12-month kind of stuff, then you're just going to end up with revenue or EBITDA and quite frankly, most people don't care about that, because most people aren't going to see the upside of that directly. It's an indirect thing. So I think when you have something to anchor to that's a little bit further out, it can be a better combination of quantifiable things as well as the qualitative things that make it soul enriching enough to want you to be part of it. And I think that is probably the key at the top. And I think because most people get caught in the day-to-dayness of what has to be done, we don't afford the emphasis that maybe we should. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it has to be more than what most people do. And I think it means that everyone becomes transactional, and then ultimately your team loses over time.
All right. So with that, everyone, another subject that's filled with complexity, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Be fabulous.